December 25th, 1945. A day that was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration turned into a nightmare for the Sodder family that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. On that fateful night, a fire erupted in their house, completely engulfing the second floor, where 5 of the 9 children were peacefully resting. The parents and 4 of their kids managed to escape the inferno, but the other 5, ranging in age from 5 to 14, weren't so lucky. What's truly baffling is that not a single trace of the poor children was found among the remains of the burned house, leading the family members to believe that those 5 souls didn't actually perish in the fire. Instead, perhaps kidnapped. The disappearance of the Sodder children has become one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in American history, leaving many wondering what really happened to those 5 innocent kids on that Christmas night. This is the Sodder family. 9 children, aged from 2 to 22, and their parents, George Sodder and Jenny Cipriani. George had a pretty eventful early life. He was born in Sardinia, Italy, in 1895 as Giorgio Soddu. At the age of 13, he migrated to the United States and changed his name to George Sodder. His brother, who accompanied him to the States, ultimately returned to Italy, leaving George alone. After starting his own trucking company, he met his future wife, Jenny, who also immigrated from Italy, in a local store. They would eventually settle in Fayetteville, a small town in West Virginia. The Sodder family was a numerous yet extremely respected middle-class family among a prominent Italian immigrant community. But one aspect of the Sodder family was never shared with anyone: the reason behind George's immigration from Italy. Everyone who immigrated had a story to tell, and was pretty open to share it. But not George. The only thing we knew about his past is his strongly opposed ideas regarding dictator Benito Mussolini during the 1940s. These strong opposed opinions often made Sodder argue pretty severely with other members of the local Italian immigrant community, which were starting to get irritated whenever the Sodders were around. After settling down in their new home, they began noticing strange behaviors coming from other people visiting their house. During the fall of 1945, a man approached the Sodder family house, potentially seeking work. He circled the house and reached the backyard, pointing at 2 fuse boxes. Out of basically nowhere, he stated, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George was sort of baffled by his comment, since those same fuse boxes had just been recently checked by a power company, which deemed them fine. Another strange episode occurred around the same period. A man tried to sell life insurance to the Sodders, and became irrationally furious when George declined his offer, at a point when he stated, quote, "Your damn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed," blaming George for, quote, "your dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." A time traveler? Or, we can agree that if the statement reported by George is true, this man probably knew a thing or two regarding the fate of the Sodder family. The older son, John, also recalled having seen a car parked along the US Highway 21, with a man inside it, just days before Christmas, avidly spying on the kids as they left school. It's just past midnight. It's Christmas Day. The children started opening a few presents, and at 12:30 a.m., everyone was now in their rooms, preparing to sleep. The phone suddenly rang. Jenny got out of bed and went to answer it, and she was kinda startled by what she'd heard. It was an unknown female voice, asking about a name which she never heard before. Jenny responded that she probably called the wrong number, and at that point, the unknown woman started to laugh. An eerie laugh, with more people laughing in the background. The woman suddenly hung up. Jenna returned to bed, but noticed that the downstairs lights were still on, and the front door was unlocked. After falling asleep, she got woken up by something that, quote, hit the roof like a rubber ball, and hit the ground with a thump. She ultimately ignored the noise and returned to sleep. Just past 1 a.m., the fire erupted. Jenna and George were woken up by the intense smoke odor coming from the second floor, where the kids were resting. The parents screamed at the top of their lungs to wake the children up. 4 of them fled down the main staircase to reunite with the parents, escaping the fire and getting safe outside the burning house. At that moment, George noticed that the other 5 children were missing outside. He quickly realized that they were still inside that inferno. He immediately tried to get back inside the house, but it was completely engulfed in flames. Living room, kitchen, office, staircase, all impractical to walk into due to thick smoke and flames. So he walked up to a side window in an attempt to get inside the house. He always kept a ladder close to that window, which that night was strangely missing. He tried to climb on top of one of his trucks to reach the window, but when he tried to turn it on, to move it under the window, it wouldn't want to start. He was now impotent. He had no way of helping his children. Marion, the oldest sister, sprinted to a neighbor house in an attempt to call the fire department since their phone wasn't working, but no one answered. A second neighbor, who saw the large pile of smoke, tried to call help, but again, they received no answer. They finally decided to find the fire chief of the town in person, and, after a phone tree, where a firefighter would call the other, then the other, and so on, finally, the fire department arrived on scene. Yeah, 7 hours later, it's 8 a.m. By that time, the house was completely reduced to ash and dust. Why did they take so long? That's a great question, considering that the fire station was distant just above 2 miles from the Sodder's house. When the fire department and police arrived on scene, they expected to find the remains of the poor kids. But this wasn't the case. There was absolutely no trace whatsoever. The parts which would survive the heat of the fire, the bones, were nowhere to be found. Fire Chief Morris stated that the heat of the fire, albeit extreme, would not completely vaporize the remains of the bodies. The site was buried under 5 feet of dirt as a memorial of the 5 children, which later became the base in which on top a sign would be created, seeking help from the public, and a $5,000 ransom for information. A state police inspector ultimately stated that the fire was likely caused by faulty wiring and the cause of death as fire or suffocation. All things considered, the Sodders weren't really convinced that their kids perished in the fire. It was strange to them that no remains were found. With this strong conviction, their lengthy, exhausting investigation started. Jenny decided to investigate and test herself the damage that a fire can do to flesh. She burned different types of animal meat and bones, and every time, the fire would leave a pile of charred bones as a leftover from the combustion. She contacted a crematorium worker who told her that the bones are usually the only remains after a 2-hour fire at 2000 degrees. The house was completely reduced to dust in just 45 minutes, so it's more than plausible that there had to be some leftovers from the burned house. In order to assist them with the investigations, the Sodders decided to hire a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley. Remember the weird salesman threatening George about a damn fire? Tinsley discovered that that same salesman was a member of the group of coroners who labeled the fire as accidental. Okay, let's take a step back. Let's focus on this. Soon after the fire, the Sodders received a number of strange reports. First of all, A telephone repairman who analyzed the telephone lines on site stated the telephone line inside the house had appeared to be cut just mere minutes before the fire erupted, not burned during the fire. If it was really a faulty wiring related fire, then how come the Christmas lights were still on during the early stages of the fire, as reported by the Sodders? Plus, as stated before, the electrical boxes of the house had also recently been rewired and rechecked. It's unlikely that they will straight up fail like that. Remember the loud thump heard by Jenny? In the days after the fire, she recalled having seen a small, green hard rubber object in the yard. She called a specialist, who ultimately concluded that the object was likely a napalm pineapple bomb, possibly tossed at the roof of the house to start the fire, explaining the loud bang. This theory would also line up with a bus driver report, who was passing through Fayetteville during Christmas time, seeing people throwing what appeared to be balls of fire at the house. Private investigator Teasley also uncovered a story about the fire chief F.J. Morris, told to a Fayetteville minister who personally knew Teasley. During the fire site inspection, Morris confidentially said that he found a heart among the remains of the burned house and stored it inside a dynamite box, which had been then buried underground in the scene. Fire Chief Morris was ultimately convinced by Teasley to investigate further about the found heart. They reached the scene, unburied the box, and brought the heart to a funeral specialist. He concluded that the presumed heart was a beef liver, which had no signs of burning. Rumors then began to spread regarding Morris sharing to his colleagues that he didn't actually discover the organ on the scene. He deliberately put the liver there in an attempt to make the family think that the kids ultimately died in the fire, to cease the investigation once and for all. Having heard these rumors, the family was now more determined than ever to give light to the fate of their children. The Sodders decided to call Oscar B. Hunter, an acclaimed Washington, D.C. pathologist. During a long excavation in 1949, these were the items found: some damaged coins, a worn and burned dictionary, and several shards of what appeared to be vertebrae. These were immediately sent to the Smithsonian Research Institution, which concluded that they were indeed parts of vertebrae and all belonged to one individual. The presumed age of the individual at death was, quote, 16 or 17 years. The top limit age should be about 22 years. The Sodders reported to the institution that the oldest kid involved in the fire was 14, to which they responded, quote, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than a 14-year-old boy. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a 14-year-old to show 16-17 maturation. Furthermore, the vertebrae showed no signs of burning, and no other bones were found in the area. One would expect to find other signs of burned bodies from 5 casualties. The report ultimately stated that the vertebrae found were likely already present in the dirt used by George to cover the fire site. During the late 40s, more reports regarding sightings of their presumed children were directed to the Sodder family. This is the most significant. Ida Crutchfield, the owner of a Charlestown hotel, a few miles from Fayetteville, stated having seen the 5 missing children in her hotel, accompanied by 4 Italian-speaking men and women, approximately 1 week after the fire, and around midnight. She recalled having tried to talk to one of the kids, but the men were aggressive and didn't let anyone come close to them. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner, turned around and began speaking rapidly in Italian. They registered at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They then left the hotel the morning after. Although this sightseeing would lead the case to the involvement of some Italian criminal organization, the investigators didn't deem this witness report entirely credible. Since she claimed to have seen the kids 1 week after the fire, having seen their faces for the first time in a newspaper 2 years after the fire, and came forward with the statement only 7 years later. Not entirely believable. After receiving further reports, which didn't seem to contain significant proof of the fate of the children, came possibly the biggest piece of evidence that one of their sons was still alive. Jenny received a letter in the mail addressed to her with a Kentucky postmark, strangely with no return address. This is what it contained. A picture of a man in his late 20s, early 30s, with, as Jenna stated, a very strong resemblance to his missing son Louis, who too had been around 30 years old if he'd been still alive. Straight prominent nose, dark hair and eyes, slight tilt of his left eyebrow. It had to be him. They had no more options available. Based on these resemblances, the Sodders decided to hire another private investigator, sending him to Kentucky to investigate the place where the picture came from. They never heard anything from him ever again. George Sodder died in 1968, after releasing a statement the year before. We only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. During the years following her husband's death, Jenny continued to isolate herself more and more, constantly wearing black clothes, perishing alone in 1989. It is unclear if more reports came during the following years, but what's certain is that the remaining children continued the search for their lost siblings. Some of them stated that the local mafia reached out to them, trying to recruit them and extort them money. They were also convinced that their missing siblings were probably kidnapped by someone they knew. The kidnappers had possibly burst into their house through the unlocked front door and kidnapped them with the excuse of bringing them somewhere safe. Sylvia Sodder, the last surviving child involved in the accident, 2 years old at the time of the fire, perished at 79 in 2021, after battling with a long illness. In the numerous interviews she had done, she always recalled having seen her dad screaming for help during that inferno, with blood coming down his arm, possibly cut by debris, a sighting she would never forget. She was ultimately convinced that her brothers and sisters didn't die in the fire. What tangible evidence do we have then? Well, really the only physical thing are the vertebrae found. But it's strange that they didn't have any signs of burning, and no other bones were found in the area. We then have the eyewitnesses' reports of people who claim to have seen the kids after the fire, but being eyewitnesses means that we can prove them. So if you ask me, yeah, probably some sketch organization was involved in the case, because of those strange accusations made by those men threatening George and his kids about them dying in a fire, that possible sighting in the hotel with the Italian man, and George not really going along with the local Italian community regarding extremist ideas about Mussolini. But I believe that if it was really a deliberate act, then their ultimate intention was to provocate the fire, killing the children in the process, not to kidnap them. The mafia would kidnap for a ransom. However, no one really came up to the Sodders asking for money in return for the missing kids. There really are countless theories across the web about this enduring mystery. Complete accident, deliberate act. But what really strikes me is the fact that not even the remaining children, now deceased, never had any answer about the fate of their other 5 siblings that Christmas night.